close the door? Thank you very much. Does everybody here know who Al-Ghazali was? Or do I need to go through? We all know who Al-Ghazali was?
Yes.
Good, excellent. Very interesting thinker, of course, one of the most important Islamic thinkers of all time. Very difficult thinker to pin down, though, because as Ibn Rushd said about him in the Tahafut al-Tahafut, Al-Ghazali is a Sufi with the Sufis, he's a philosopher with the philosophers, he's a mutakallim with the mutakallimun. He does seem to have a whole variety of different views which vary according to the context within which he's performed. I mean, so he's a very difficult thinker to actually classify. And of course, in his life, he changed his views on a number of issues. So, as is normal, you start off believing one thing and you end up believing something else perhaps. And as we know, towards the end of his life, he became much more interested in Sufism of a particular form, and he became much more hostile as his intellectual career continued to forms of Shia thought, especially the Ismailis, and also to philosophy, the sort of philosophy which existed at the time, represented mainly by Ibn Sina and his followers. But he wrote many works which seemed not to share these sorts of views. So he wrote philosophical works which seemed to be just as philosophical as the works of the people whom he attacked. He wrote theological works which also were rather similar to many of the people that he attacked at one stage or another. So he's a very difficult thinker to pin down. But what I'd like to talk about a bit is his approach to rationality and whether he's successful in creating a new way of defining rationality within the Islamic world, which is certainly, I think, something that he was interested in trying to do. He did seem to want to try and establish a new way of doing things, a way which is going to be both intellectually satisfying and also religiously acceptable. Two difficult things to get right in the same view. And I'm going to look at that a bit. He argued in his latest work, in his most mature work, that if you know something, it's not just a matter of intellectual knowledge. Yaqeen, certainty. Yaqeen is not just a matter of what the philosophers call burhan, demonstrative knowledge. It's not just a matter of having a syllogism which starts with a definition and then you end up logically, validly with a conclusion in which you can be completely certain. It's not like that. That's what the philosophers call certainty. That's not satisfactory to Al-Ghazali, because he argues that certainty has to have a subjective element, it has to have a personal element, it has to relate to me. It's got to be like light shining on me from God, where you know, not just in an intellectual way, but you know in a personal way, in a way which cannot be doubted, that what you know, and it's not just something you think. So, for example, were I to discover that, in fact, I think today is Tuesday the 5th of March, because that's when I'm supposed to be giving this lecture in Birmingham. But suppose it wasn't, suppose I was wrong, and suppose, in fact, I'm now dreaming I'm giving this lecture. I don't usually dream about giving lectures, it's bad enough having to give them. But people do dream about doing things, don't they? So suppose I'm dreaming about giving a lecture and I discover that it isn't in fact Tuesday the 5th of March, but it's still Monday the whatever, 4th of March, and I'm thinking about the lecture. Or it's Wednesday, the 6th of March, and I'm thinking about the lecture that I gave. That wouldn't be shocking, because we do make mistakes like that, don't we? We often think things are completely certain, but we're wrong. We're wrong. And we say, I thought I knew it, but later on I discovered that I didn't know it. That even happens with reasoning processes, because of course we can make mistakes when we use our reason. Al-Ghazali is trying to find a notion of rationality which can't be wrong in these ways, because when divine light is thrown on us, we can't argue about whether it's true or not, because we immediately know it's true. The possibility of doubt is completely ruled out. And that's not just because of what we know, but how we know it. So there is that subjective factor. We just have to know. We just have to have that feeling. Of course, we can have a lot of feelings that we know things without the feelings being at all justified. In fact, we get more and more angry when our claims to know something are challenged, often the weaker they are. We often feel that there is something we can't possibly be wrong about, but we can be. Al-Ghazali argues, though, that knowledge, real certainty, has to have some connection with heaven, or with God, or with something deeper than ourselves, which is a perfect marker that it's really knowledge. Now, what is this thing, though? What is this feeling, this sensation, this idea, this image that Al-Ghazali says that we have to have, and which, when we have it, validates our claim that we have a knowledge event, as it were, a real knowledge event. For him, it's tied up with what he calls prophecy, what he calls prophetic experience. Not that he claims to be a prophet. But the idea here is that there must be more than just the individual trying to work out what's true. There's got to be something happening at the other end for a religious notion of knowledge to actually make sense. I'd like to sort of work towards that a bit, because Al-Ghazali argues he's a great opponent of taqlid, of doing things just following blindly. And when I was preparing for this talk, I thought, I'll look up what people say about taqlid. And I came across a wonderful lecture on Al Jazeera by Al-Qaradawi, in which he argues that the Arabic word taqlid, or blind imitation, or just following something without thinking about it, he argued it comes from an Arabic word qalada, or necklace, and it's like something which is like restricting you from actually doing something outside of a particular boundary. And the notion of taqlid is the idea that you do something just because somebody tells you to do it. Al-Ghazali is very, very critical about taqlid. Even appropriate authorities should not be followed blindly, he argues. Yet, isn't taqlid an essential aspect of religion? Taqlid, we do things just because people tell us to do them. That's the whole point of religion. Of course, there is some explanation of it. I was just reading in the newspaper upstairs, the Muslim News, or whatever it's called. I didn't bring it with me. And there was a bit of a discussion. Somebody wrote in and objected, because in the last issue of the Muslim News, on the front page, there was a photograph of a pig. And there was a discussion as to whether it is halal to have a picture of a pig in a Muslim newspaper. And some people said no, and some people said yes. But this is a perfect example of where taqlid tends to operate, because you go to the sheikh or you go to the judge and you say, what is the ruling of your school on pictures of pigs, for example? And different legal authorities will have different views, and they'll give the view. And then if you're a member of that school, you will follow that view because you're a member of that school, and you follow that view. In exactly the same way as I am now following, I hope, the rules of English grammar. I don't know why they are the rules of English grammar, because I'm not a linguist or a grammarian. But I am following the rules of English grammar. I'm following taqlid. I'm blindly imitating the rules of the language which many years ago I learnt, or tried to learn. So that's what I'm doing. I'm blind. I don't know, why do we have these rules in English? Who knows? You know what a peculiar language English is, with its strange varieties of grammatical rules. Why are they there? Well, who knows? But we just learn them. And you learn the rules, you speak the language, hopefully. And we don't have time to investigate the reason for everything, do we? I mean, we just don't. There are some things, hopefully, we know about a lot, but most things we don't. And there we have to rely on taqlid. We have to imitate somebody and learn from them and copy them. That's how children learn, isn't it? They copy, they imitate, they follow, that's terribly important in religion, among other things. Because, of course, there is a big relationship, perhaps, between taqlid and another Arabic word, turat. I mean, the idea of tradition. The idea of things which have always been done, and always will be done, and always should be done. And again, why is a tradition a tradition? It's a tradition because it's the tradition, or people say it's a tradition. And in fact, there's nothing often so modern as tradition, is there? I mean, what people call traditional is often something quite new and has been developed to sort out a particular issue which is suddenly current. But, the idea of tradition, the idea of blindly imitating somebody, these are very important ideas in religion, yet Al-Ghazali, who is trying to revive religion, he says, trying to revive Islam, he's very critical of these ideas, and he, especially taqlid. He says, well, we really shouldn't blindly imitate things. We should only do something, especially in religion, if we really understand why we're doing it. Not necessarily that we understand everything about it, but we need to understand some aspects of it, enough so that we actually think about why we do what we do. Yet surely, religion's not like that, is it? I mean, you learn how to do things in religion. There are rituals in religion. They don't have any particular reason, do they? I mean, why do different religious groups eat certain things or not? Well, we don't really know, do we? Or why are people not supposed to do certain things? Because God tells us to. I mean, why do Muslims go on Hajj? Because God tells them to go on Hajj. It's not. Other religions don't have ceremonies like pilgrimages. Some religions do. I mean, it's not as though they have to have a particular form. You do it because you're told to do it. And if God tells you to do something, then I suppose you ought to take very seriously into consideration, what he tells you. Is that taqlid? Is that to blindly imitate what you're told to do. Well, if God tells you to do something, I mean, if, for example, we go to a cinema to watch a movie and a fire breaks out, and somebody stands up and says, everybody run to the door over there. It's different if the guy who stands up and says that is a fire officer. I mean, if there's a fire officer in the building, an actual fireman or a firewoman, and he or she says, go out of that door, that's somebody you could blindly imitate because you think, or for example, another example that Ghazali gives. I mean, if you go to a physician and you say, I've got this wrong with me, and the physician says, well, you know, take this 3 times a day. You know, you don't necessarily have to understand why taking that 3 times a day will be a good thing. You just do it, because you may say, well, this person knows, I don't know. Or if your car breaks down, you may take it to the mechanic. He or she opens up the bonnet and looks inside. I mean, you've got no idea what's going on inside the engine, because if you did, you'd probably be able to fix it yourself. You hope he or she does. Taqlid, you give them the car, and they say, come back tomorrow and we'll have fixed it. And then you pay me so much money. Taqlid, you do it. You know, you just do it. And if God is going to give you instructions, isn't this even more reason just to do it blindly, without thinking about it? Because you trust the person you're dealing with, and that's especially the case with God. And so you just, you know, you put yourself in the hands of God, and you just do whatever it is that you're supposed to do, you think. But not according to Al-Ghazali. That is not an appropriate attitude to take in religion, he argues. Although some people, he suggests, who really can't think about these issues, perhaps because they're not intellectually very gifted, or they just don't have time, for them they can just do what they're told to do. But he sort of argues that this is a very poor way of operating in religion, you know. But why? But why? I mean, isn't it an essential aspect of religion that we do things without really thinking about why we do them? Once we've accepted that the Quran is the word of God, for example, then there are things that follow from that, you know, and we do them without thinking about it. I mean, why not? Because once we've accepted that the physician is somebody who we can trust, we do whatever he or she says. I mean, isn't that quite simple? Once we know that the mechanic is a good mechanic, we trust him, and so on and so forth. I mean, that seems to be a reasonable way of looking at things, but not according to Al-Ghazali. Because according to him, blind imitation is a real problem. Doing things because they're traditional is a real problem. It's not appropriate for a religious person to act in that way, he says, because if you give it to somebody else to work out for you, I guess, you don't have that feeling, that personal feeling, which is so important for you, that connection with God, where your heart, this is an expression he uses a lot, where your heart actually lights up your body and tells you that what you're doing is the right thing. Because you, as it were, you give that role to somebody else, to the expert. The expert maybe has that feeling. And I suppose, you know, I mean, somebody who's very skilled at doing a practical thing, you know, somebody who's very skilled practically, when they, I mean, being a plumber, being a carpenter, being a bricklayer, being a roofer, being an automobile mechanic, it's all about problem solving. They try to do it in this way, they try to do it in that way, they try something else, and in the end they get it right, we hope. And then when they get it right, there's that very nice feeling that they have, I'm sure, where they understand everything about the particular problem which they are now about to solve, where the obstacles and the solution all come into some sort of synchronicity, and the situation is completely resolved in a satisfactory manner. That's like what Al-Ghazali thinks is certain knowledge, where you have that feeling of a solution lighting itself up in your mind, as it were, and resolving a situation which is completely fresh in a sense, because every situation is different. I mean, every house that a builder works on is slightly different from every other house. Every leak is slightly different from, previous leaks that plumbers deal with. In the end, they solve it. Perhaps they try a few things which don't work, and then they solve it. And they get that feeling, perhaps, that everything that was up in the air, as it were, and needed to be resolved, is suddenly finished. There is a solution. Like a mathematician trying to work out how to solve a mathematical problem, like a philosopher trying to work out an argument which he or she is going to use, and which they're not quite sure what the parameters of the argument are. Like most of us, when we try to solve some problem, when we solve it, we get that idea often of, to use Al-Ghazali's expression, light. Suddenly it's lit up, the solution becomes clear. And then often afterwards, it's very difficult for us to understand how we couldn't get it right, because it seems so obvious after we've gone through perhaps that long process. And some people, of course, never get it right. Not necessarily because they're stupid, but because they're not able to work in that medium of wood or water or electricity or theology or philosophy or spirituality for Al-Ghazali. Not everybody can do it. And also for him, what's very important is not everything is not enough for us to do things. God also has to do something. I mean, we can't demand that the light appears when we're thinking about something. We have to prepare ourselves to receive the light. But God has to decide, we hope, to send the light. He may decide not to. So of course it's really up to God to say what's certain or not. I mean, is this a reasonable way of looking at what we call certainty in religion? For Al-Ghazali it is. It's very important in religion that we don't just know things that are true, but we know things which are personally true. I mean, it's got to hit us, as religious truths have got to strike us as being personally relevant. They can't just be dry and dull generalizations for him. That's not what we call a religion. That's what we call philosophy, perhaps. And philosophy and religion are different things, although they may agree on many issues. So certainty has to have this personal aspect to it. But surely religion, often doesn't have that personal aspect. It often does involve taqlid, precisely imitating blindly what somebody tells you, especially a religion which is based on law, like Islam. I mean, you will have heard many times, I'm sure, somebody say, Islam is, and then you get some argument. I mean, Al-Ghazali himself spent most of his life criticizing that approach of Islam. So, for example, in his critique of the Ismailis, he criticized the Ismailis for saying Islam is, and then the sort of Shia doctrines that the Ismailis weren't very keen on. And the particular aspect of that Al-Ghazali disapproved of was the idea that there is this esoteric knowledge, this hidden, secret knowledge, which is not available to all Muslims. And so for most Muslims, they have to follow a particular formula, which is a pale imitation of what's really true. That's what Al-Ghazali thought the Ismailis were arguing. And I mean, not that unreasonably, because the Ismailis then, and indeed still today, do have a very strong notion of the esoteric. I mean, the Ismailis, of course, at the time of Al-Ghazali, the Ismailis controlled a huge amount of territory in the Islamic world, but virtually all their subjects were not Shia. And so the Ismailis were sort of putting forward their doctrines, but in a very restrictive way. I mean, only Ismailis can really understand the truth of these doctrines. Everybody else just has to practice a form of Islam, which, you know, they find acceptable to them. And we'll just sort of leave it at that. Now, Al-Ghazali thought that was a terrible view of religion. You know, it's as though there are these small group of people who really understand what's going on. And this is also his objection to philosophers. Again, they argue, the philosophers argue, there's a small group of people, the philosophers, who understand what's really going on. And everybody else, you know, they have these ideas about the afterlife and about, you know, God listening to us when we pray and whatnot. But these are stupid ideas that, you know, ordinary people have them. But the philosophers, they can really work out the truth by using the reason alone. Everybody else needs religion. And then they have a very indirect route to the truth. But the philosophers, like the Ismailis, they have a sort of a privileged access to the truth, whereas everybody else has a rather indirect connection to the truth. Now, taqlid is a very useful doctrine if you are an elitist in that way, because you say to people, well, you won't really understand the truth of this issue. So if you just do what we tell you to do, or just do what you've always done, that's good enough. You know, but you'll never penetrate into the deep inner truth that a small group of people have access to. Al-Ghazali thought that was a terrible way of looking at religion, you know, because it's just so elitist. We have to use this expression, I suppose. It restricts religion in its real sense to a very small group of people. But the whole point of religion is that it's available to everybody. I mean, that's what religion is for, isn't it? Even according to the philosophers. Religion is there, according to the philosophers, to represent to everybody the basic truths which only philosophers can really understand. I mean, Ibn Rushd, for example, said that the Prophet Muhammad was the greatest politician who ever existed, he argued. Because if you're a good politician, if you're an excellent politician, you're able to explain to everybody within the community how they ought to behave, even though everybody in the community is very different with everybody else. And the Prophet Muhammad was the greatest of prophets, he argued, because he was able to do this. Of course, he had help from Gabriel and and God. But I mean, the point here is that religion is, for the philosophers, is the public version of the private truths that only philosophers really have access to. Now that's a terrible way of looking at religion, according to Al-Ghazali, because it suggests that most of us, we just have to follow what somebody tells us to do, without understanding it, without knowing why, without being able to really ask why. We just do what we're told to do. You know, this is what Islam is, depending on what sort of Muslim you are. It is these things, and you do these things, and that's fine, and that's it. But for Al-Ghazali, that is not the way in which a religion should or can present itself, because it totally sucks the emotion out of it. You know, because the individual believer doesn't really understand why he or she is doing what they're doing. They're just doing something that they're told to do. And as we know, I mean, those of you who have been part of the educational process, you know it's not a good way, if you're teaching somebody to do something, it's not a good idea to teach them just to copy you. I mean, I know when children drive you mad and they keep on saying why, as children sometimes do. Sometimes we say, just do it because I tell you to do it, you know. And, you know, I have to admit that I don't approve of hitting children, but I did hit one of my children when she ran into the road, because I thought it's better to hit somebody and stop her running into the road, and with the hope that she survives, rather than to say, well, you know, I mean, I couldn't possibly interfere with your freedom to, you know, if you want to run in front of that lorry, you know, there's nothing I can do about it. But I don't think you can really say that to a 2 or 3-year-old. I mean, I don't think you can keep them alive for very long. But we do know it's not a good idea, is it, in education? It's not a good idea to say to children or students, do it because I tell you to do it. This is the way we do it. You know, it doesn't have a reason, you just do it. That is not a good way to teach people to do things, because then they're not critical enough about how they do things, and they're not likely to do them properly, you know, because they don't understand what goes on. And surely, Al-Ghazali says, this is even more the case with religion. I mean, God does not want us just to blindly imitate human beings who interpret God's word in a particular way, as though that's all you have to do. Well, you say to somebody, you know, what do I do in such and such a situation? And he or she says, oh, you do this. And then I just do it without thinking about it. Well, Al-Ghazali says, that's a terrible way to treat religion. You know, it's like coming to a country. I mean, there's no reason, is there, why in England we drive on, what do we drive? On the left side of the road, until I don't drive. In America, we drive on the right side of the road. I mean, there's no reason for it, is there? It's just how it's worked out. I think in America, they tend to do things. After the American Revolution, the Americans decided to do lots of things just because it was the opposite to how the English used to do it. Because I know in America, the racing horses, the horse tracks go around the opposite way to how they go around in England. And that was precisely to do it in the opposite way to the way in which the English did it. But I suppose that's a sort of a reason. There's no reason why you should drive on one side of the road, or why your horses should go clockwise or anti-clockwise, is there? I mean, it's just how we do it. And once you've learned that, there's not a great deal more to investigate about that sort of issue. But when it comes to religion, you might think, when it comes to religion, you know, who can tell, you know, how can this be just something that you do just because you're told to do it, Al-Ghazali says? I mean, that's a terrible way of looking at religion. You know, it's as though it's just a set of rules that you just follow. You know, just... And of course, as Ghazali says, for many people that is what religion is. It's just a set of rules that you follow. I remember listening to a woman in Washington, D.C., who was a local politician, and she was wearing hijab. She was Muslim, and she was asked what reception she got when she was speaking to non-Muslim Washington, D.C. residents. And she said, fine. She said, you know, we all have issues about, you know, what we want to do in Washington. And, you know, I mean, although I'm a Muslim, she says, you know, being a Muslim is just one of the things that I am. I'm other things. I'm a woman, I'm an American, I'm a Democrat, I'm a this, I'm a that. And I was thinking as I was listening to her that Ghazali would have hated that answer. Because what Ghazali thinks she should have said is the most important thing in my life is being a Muslim. Everything else, the other things are also important, but that is the most important thing. Nothing else comes up to that level of importance. And although we all have, you know, a variety of identities, we come from a particular country, we have certain political views, you know, religion's not just one of those things, according to Ghazali. You know, it's not like supporting a particular football team. Although there is a saying in England that, you know, in life everything changes. You know, you change, maybe you change your religion, you change your job, you change who you're married to, you change where you live, but you never change the football team that you support. And it is true, it's interesting, because you often find people living hundreds of miles away from their original football team, but they have always supported that particular football team. So we do have these allegiances, but I mean, supporting a sports team has no rationale to it, does it? You just support a particular team. It's not as though it's inconceivable that you would support another team. Of course, there are fanatical supporters of football teams. And the only time I've actually seen somebody killed was at a football ground in England. I went to support my team. And we scored a goal. And somebody put a knife in the back of one of our supporters. Not very far from it, could have been me. And killed him in the bad old days of soccer violence. And I'm sure the person who murdered the football supporter was exactly the same sort of person as the person he murdered. So it's very difficult to know how to explain that sort of behavior, except in the sense that people often get so worked up and excited that they just can't control what they do. Now, Ghazali would like that emotion, in a sense, and insist on that as being part of religion. He hates the idea of people doing religious things. And you know, if you're not interested in football, and you say to somebody, well, I can't understand why everybody gets so excited about people running around after a bit of plastic. You know, I mean, that is what football is about, after all. People are running around after a bit of plastic and they're kicking it. It's not leather anymore, is it? And they're kicking it at various places. You know, and yet 60,000 people stand up or sit down or cry or cheer or throw things at each other. I mean, or it ruins their weekend when their team loses. People are killed. People spend a vast amount of money going to games. So there's passion involved for a lot of people. If somebody were to say, well, I'm a supporter of a particular team, but I don't really care whether whether they will or not, or, I don't know how they're doing, and, I'm not... Well, you wouldn't say they were much of a supporter. I mean, they are a supporter in the sense of taqlid for Al-Ghazali. They are so used to saying they support X team that if anybody asks them what team do you support, they say X. They don't think about it. Taqlid. They've always supported X. But now they don't know who any of the players for X are, they don't know how they're doing, they don't even know what division they're in. That's for Al-Ghazali, that is totally inappropriate if that's going to be your attitude towards religion. I mean, this is religion. This is your relationship with God. You can't just do something because somebody told you to do it. You've got to really understand why it is as you say it is. And you've got to feel that God is responding to you in a direct and powerful sort of way. Otherwise, it's not religion, he argues. And yet, I come to the point, which I've mentioned several times before, isn't religion, a lot of religion, about imitation? It's about doing things that people tell you what to do. I mean, that's what religion is. I mean, suppose, for example, you were a Muslim and Arabic is not your native language. Well, then you have to learn Arabic if you're going to read the Quran. And learning Arabic, especially Quranic Arabic, is not easy. You have to have a teacher. And I remember many years ago going to a Quran school in Cairo for the little boys who were learning to memorize the Quran. And there were about 80 boys in this quite big room. And the teacher had this huge stick. And the boys were all reciting and reading. And if you made a mistake, this stick would go whack you on the side of your head. And I tell you, they got to be good readers, not surprising. But I mean, somebody has to tell you. Of course, a lot of people recite it without even knowing what they're saying. That's taqlid. But it's a part of the educational process, isn't it? We all do that. We all learn things without actually understanding perhaps why they mean what they mean or how they mean what they mean. So, as long as we move on to something else, a slightly deeper way of understanding what we're doing, surely it's okay. Surely we can't insist that everybody has this deep emotional relationship with God that Al-Ghazali sort of insists on here. I mean, surely for many people, religion, many people are very unemotional, naturally, about everything. They don't get excited. They're calm. They're relaxed. They are Muslims, but they're not going to go around and, do things which are particularly dramatic. They feel they have a relationship with God, but they don't feel the necessity constantly to reassert that relationship, or reinterpret it, or emphasize it. I mean, it's just a part of their lives, but it's not something which is necessarily going to be an issue for them all the time. I mean, they may have a very easy relationship with God, they may think. They pray, they do religious things they're supposed to do. But they never feel that sort of emotional response that Al-Ghazali talks about. But they do everything that's not for them. That's not their way of being religious. Their way of being religious is different. But that's taqlid, according to Al-Ghazali. They're just doing it without that personal, subjective, emotional flavour to it, which he thinks is terribly important as part of religious knowledge. So I think here, we have an issue which is a difficult issue to know how to resolve. It is a very difficult issue to know how to resolve. Is Al-Ghazali arguing that if you're religious, you've got to allow religion to completely dominate your life and psychology, so that this is the most important part of your life, and you've got to be enthusiastic about it, you've got to have deep feelings, you've got to be totally committed to it, you've got to throw everything at it, as it were. The rest of your life has to be structured around it. As Al-Ghazali says, every time you pray, you tremble, you're in the presence of God, you prepare yourself in a whole range of ways to make sure that you have this deep emotion. So there's that form of being religious, which he insists is the really only acceptable form of being a Muslim. Or is there that other aspect of religion, which perhaps is what most people experience, where religion is just one way of you being you? Yes, you pray, you wear certain clothes perhaps, you eat certain food, you do certain things, but, it's like being conservative or being Liverpudlian or being, there are other things about you as well which are important, perhaps more important to defining you. Now for Al-Ghazali, you can't say that about religion. Religion is an all or nothing thing. Unless you have that emotion coming at you from deep at the heart of the religion. He's keen on this expression heart all the time. Heart as being a symbol of knowing things emotionally, where we know something emotionally. Like we love somebody, like we love God, or God loves us. It's something that's very much reflected in the heart, according to Al-Ghazali. And the heart for him doesn't just mean something emotional, it also means something rational. So for him, religion has to be this connection between the emotions and reason. So when I'm talking about the construction of a new type of rationality for Al-Ghazali, religion has to be both rational and emotional at the same time. It can't be one without being the other, he argues. But aren't these two things pulling us in different directions? Doesn't rationality pull us in the direction of order, organization? The sensation that we've done the right thing, which Al-Ghazali hates in religion, the idea, for example, that you come to the end of your 5 prayers of the day, and you say to yourself, well, I've done everything I should have done. He hates that idea, because you can never really do everything that you're supposed to do according to him. But that is an idea that many religious people, they're very happy being religious, they're happy doing their prayers, carrying out their religious duties, and they have this feeling that they have done what they ought to have done as a Muslim, or as a Christian, or as a Jew, or as a Hindu. Actually, this issue arises in all religions, of course. For Al-Ghazali, that is not an appropriate way of looking at a religion. You can't keep on, you've got to be rational, but you've got to be emotional at the same time. They've got to blend with each other. And he argues that Islam is the best religion because it is, at least of the three Abrahamic religions, it is the best at linking rationality with emotion. It provides the clearest, most comprehensive, and most usable way of combining these different techniques. Taqlid is totally inappropriate. Blind imitation is totally inappropriate because it's a technical thing. It's a technical thing. Am I doing what I ought to do? You go to an expert and he or she tells you, yes you are, or no you're not. It's technical. It's not something that you feel personally. And so it doesn't really have a part to play in religion. Yet, and I'll finish on this point, as I've said, I'm sure many more times than I ought to have, isn't taqlid an essential aspect of what we call religion, especially Islam, especially a religion which is based on law. So, what do we think of the way in which Ghazali is trying to redefine Islam? Is he arguing that if we are going to be religious, we have to be very strenuously religious? You can't just be religious and something else. It has to dominate your life and everything you do. Is he right? Is he right in that? Or could we say that religion is just one aspect of our lives, and perhaps not even the most important aspect? That, it seems to me, is the real difficult issue that Al-Ghazali raises. He wants us to be rational, and so logical, organized, calm, dispassionate. And on the other hand, he wants us to be passionate, emotional. He wants religion to really change us as personalities. Are these two aspects of one thing, i.e. Islam, or are they trying to do two different things which can't really be covered by the same religion? And on that point, I will finish. Thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to hearing any comments you might choose to make. Thank you very much.